Wow, how many of you have gone through the new nursery? Isn't that absolutely wonderful? So thanks to Kinghorn Construction, and it's nice to see Judy Wenzel and her family here this morning. By the way, if you don't know me, I'm Dan Hegberg. Most of you do know me. Becky and I have been here a long time. And currently I serve leading adult education and church chaplain. Someone said to me the other day, what is a church chaplain? Well, in light of the fact that we are less than staff these days, my job is to help in counseling. So if you are ill or you or a family member is facing a crisis or going to the hospital, that's what I do. I come alongside. And if you need prayer, you can always call me or call the church office. Well, this morning, how big is your God box? And what are you doing with it? I was talking with Becky about a week and a half ago. I started formulating thoughts for this morning, and I appreciated that I was asked to speak this morning. And I'm also a chaplain with Volunteers of America, so I'm preaching someplace, generally a nursing home facility, every week. And I do lots of hospital visits and lots of, unfortunately, funerals. And I was excited about this idea that I had come up with, the God box. And I was talking to Becky about it, and she says, oh, but you don't know how big a deal this is. I said, yeah, I do. She said, no, you don't. You see, other people have been talking about this. Priscilla Shearer, who is the leader in the video series that our ladies are going through on Sunday morning, has mentioned this idea. So, here I thought it was original with me, but evidently not. But I'm in good company. How big is your God box? Well, what is a God box? The God box is our faith. It's our faith. It is the faith that expects God either to show up or not show up. It is the size of our faith that trusts God to be the God of all sovereign power. The grace who loved us enough to send Jesus as sacrifice. And Paul argues in Romans chapter 8 that the reason we should trust God for everything is this. Listen, what then should we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but freely gave him. He who did not spare him, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? You see, the proof that we can trust God no matter what is the cross. This is the greatest guarantee of God's presence and power that God could have given us, because it is so unbelievable that God would send his son to the cross. There's a contrast of God boxes found in Mark chapter 5. Jesus comes off a boat to a little village, and Jairus, who is the leader of the synagogue, comes to meet him with a throng of people. And Jairus says, "Teacher, my daughter is sick and about to die. Would you come? Because I know you can heal her." And so Jesus begins his journey through this little village, and a throng of people starts to grow around him because they have heard of his reputation as a great teacher, a man of God, and a healer. People who had been lame now could walk. People who had been blind could see. And it was obvious God was at work through Jesus. And so as they're going through the village, hurrying on their way to Jairus' home, Jesus all of a sudden stops and says, "Who touched me?" And there was an outcast woman who, because of a hemorrhage of blood for 12 years, had not been able to go to the temple. She was considered unclean. She could not touch a family member. She was an outcast. And Mark, I think a little bit of kind of a jab at his brother Luke, says yes, and she spent all her money on doctors and they couldn't help her. And so Jesus says to her daughter, a term of endearment, a term that she was now accepted, "Your faith has made you well." Just then, a group of people who had been at Jairus' house come to him and say, "Oh, Jairus, don't trouble the teacher any longer. We're sorry, but your daughter's dead." You see, their God box was big enough that they could hope and maybe believe that Jesus could heal Jairus' daughter. But once she had died, that was the extent of their God box. They had only come to know so much faith. And beyond that, it was beyond what they could believe. Jesus, interestingly enough, turns to this suddenly bereaved father and says, have faith. They go to the house, and Jesus says, okay, look, only Jairus' parents and my disciples are going in. Those of you who could not believe, they were shut out. And Jesus goes into the home, and he reaches down and touches her hand, and he says, Tabitha. Now, for a long time, I thought that was her name, but I was wrong. It actually is in the Greek, my dear little one. He says, my dear little one, arise. And she does. And suddenly, the God box of these people exploded. Well, that's what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm afraid that all too often we enter into times of trouble with a God box that is limited by how we have trusted and thus how we have experienced God before. Our God box is built by our lifetime experience. I remember the first time I came face to face with death. I was 8 years old. My brother was 18, and his best friend, Bill Wadan, suddenly came down with cancer. And I remember my dad, who was the chairman of the deacon board, taking me to the Wadan home, where he had gathered with the pastor, and they laid hands on Bill and asked for healing. And a month later, I remember seeing that gray casket at the front of our church. You see, my God box was influenced by that event as an 8-year-old. And so, as we're influenced by our background, all of my life, maybe like you, I've prayed for people to be healed. And I've often seen people healed, but it's normally been through means that I could explain. Medicine work, therapy work. Sometimes, as my former doctor, Dr. Freeberg, would say, if he knew you were a believer and he knew you were going to die the next day, and you said, oh, doctor, what's the prognosis? Dr. Freeberg would have said, oh, my good man, you're going to be a new man tomorrow. Well, so who is this James, and what is he all about? As we look at Scripture, I think that God gives us facets of personalities in the disciples that we can relate to see how God works, how he communicates, and what's important to God. If we were to look at Matthew, Matthew is all about the king and the kingdom. John is all about a personal, loving relationship with Jesus. James, I've come to know James pretty well. I know you'll see why Steve was reluctant over this passage this morning. James is the no-nonsense gospel writer. And as I've studied him more, I would call James the put-up-or-shut-up disciple. You see, James had seen his half-brother Jesus minister to people, healed people. He had heard his message. He had felt his heart. He had seen his love. And then he had seen how Jesus had been rejected, how he had been cruelly crucified. But then James was struck with the reality of the resurrection and the glorification of Jesus. And James could simply had no time for someone who would not trust in Jesus Christ. And so James would offer the words in James chapter 2:14. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth, hopefully, on that later. But he's talking first about, look, don't show me a faith where you're not doing anything for God. Because I don't have time for that kind of faith, an inactive faith. Well, I believe that the size of our God box determines three things about how we live life. First, the size of our God box, our faith, determines how we handle trials. Now, I imagine that just about everybody here has lived an imperfect week. Something in most of our lives have gone wrong somewhere. Some little things, some big things. Let's read what James says. He says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect, complete, and lacking in nothing. Now, as a chaplain visiting hospital rooms, I think that if I were to come to your hospital room and say, "Oh, isn't it great that you're here? Count it all joy," I think most people would throw me out. So it's interesting how James picks his words, but I think he's got a deeper meaning. He's really saying that on the basis of being justified by God through the cross, the guarantee of God's love for us, the cross, that we should confidently trust that whatever trial comes our way, that God is using that in our sanctification. Sanctification, an interesting word. Once God justifies us and redeems us, he puts us on a path to cause us to become perfect and complete. How many of you would like to be perfect and complete? You know, every morning I get up in the mirror and say, "Perfect and complete." Yeah, thanks. My wife was the first one to laugh. I say, there is room for improvement. And if you watch the TV, you know, Becky and I often watch the TV together before dinner, and it's ad after ad on this wrinkle cream and this exercise program and this eating program, and now there's luminosity because apparently we're getting more stupid. So, perfect and complete, but this is God's work, I believe, to regenerate us, to bring us back to what he originally intended his creation to be before it was stained by sin. One day he will complete that perfect and complete work in us when we stand before the throne. Well, second, the size of our God box determines how confidently and to what extent we call on the power of God, and as a result, the power that God may allow you to experience. James says, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man." I've been on a real spiritual journey the last 10 years. Pastor Tim and I have had coffee about this many times. But about 6 years ago, for one of the first times in my life, almost felt like I heard an audible voice from God one day as I was in prayer. And all of a sudden he said, this voice said, "You need to go back to seminary." No. Okay, no, I don't think I heard that. And then the next day I got the same message. And I started to learn that when God speaks, I probably should listen. And better yet, I probably should obey. So, it wasn't more than a week or so, and I was enrolled in seminary. And about the same time, Pastor John, who had been the pastor in Anoka, who is now serving as a chaplain with Volunteers of America, became ill. And he called me up and said, "I can no longer serve as a chaplain. Would you step in for me?" Okay. So I did. And then about 2 years ago, I was convicted. Not of a crime, by the way. I was convicted by God. There. Wanted to clear that up. I had a seminary professor who for preaching, had said, if you are preparing a message and you are personally not convicted, throw it away. Because if you're not convicted, how would you expect anyone else to be? Well, about 2 years ago, I was convicted by a lack of faith. And I was not seeing God's power actively at work in my life in ways that I couldn't explain. Because, see, especially as men, we like to explain everything. We like to have the answer for everything, and we don't. And so I was talking to a friend of mine I had not seen since high school about this spiritual journey. And I said, I just can't see where I've seen the power of God show up in an unexplainable, supernatural way. And he says, oh, it's happening all over the world. But in America, we are rich and lack nothing. Like the Church of Laodicea, we were not calling on the power of God like we should. That hit me. I'm not calling on the power of God like I should. So right there I prayed, God, I want you to show me your power in great ways I can't explain. And by the way, if you pray that prayer, be careful. Because God may cause you a trial. It wasn't more than 4 months later, and most of you have heard our testimony, that Becky had a pre-diagnosis of lymphoma. And as we prayed about that, I said, Becky, I'm not any longer going to pray, God, if it's your will, because I have come to learn that that is a safety valve for my lack of faith. Because, see, I don't know the specifics of God's will, but I do know the overall arching story of his will, which is that he is glorified, that he draws people to Jesus, and he wants to bless his children. We prayed very specifically that by the time she saw the surgeon, this lump would be gone. Well, all week it was there. Friday morning came. Surgeon examined her again, lymphoma. Went in for CAT scans, told we'd get results as to the next step that afternoon. And that afternoon the phone rang. Becky picked up the phone and it was the surgeon. I heard her say, uh-huh, mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. There was more conversation as she hung up. I said, so what'd she say? She said she can't explain it because she could feel the mass. She saw it. She saw the test from the other doctor. But the CAT scan came back with nothing on it. And she can't explain it. And Becky, I heard her say to the doctor, yeah, plus I can't feel it anymore and it doesn't hurt. It's gone. Well, that was really a turning point for us. So now I pray, asking God to show up and that his miraculous work will be explained in no other way than God. Very specific. Jesus said, in talking about glorifying the Father, he said, and when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to me. See, I believe that God does miracles, really does miracles, to glorify himself and to draw others to him. Story of a missionary who'd been burned out, and she decided to go to some of the worst places in Africa that she had been called to. This is recently. This woman in a place that is war-torn by drug lords, in her first 2 years has seen more than 2,000 people come to Christ. Baptized 2,000 people, started 100 churches, and by the way, in the process, she has called on the power of God for over 100 healings. That is what draws these people to her, and then accept Christ. Well, I believe that God does miracles for his glory and for his blessing for his people. And in the last 18 months, I've personally been privileged by the Lord to be involved in 6 healing miracles that I could not explain in another way. See, I think often, if you're like me most of your life, I'm just too cerebral to really believe in the extra power of God. Because we can do it. We're Americans. We have technology to heal us. No, we need to stop thinking in that way. We need to step out boldly and be a witness for God. And so I started to do that. And a few months ago, some of you have heard this story, but I had called and made an appointment with one of my vendors downtown. And so I went in to meet her, and she was sitting in her office, and she was on the phone, and I could tell she was distressed and on the verge of tears. And I heard her say, so you called 911. Not a good sign. She hung up, she said, I'm sorry for the delay, but that was my sister. And she's really scared. She's in full distress. She believes she's having a heart attack. And she's called the ambulance. And she wanted me to know that she was on her way to the hospital. And we're really scared because our mother died at 52 of a heart attack. And my sister just turned 52. And I said, you know what, Donna? I said, I have seen God show up in powerful ways of healing. Could I pray for your sister? She said, yes. I said, what's her name? She said, Michelle. I said, could I pray for her right now? She said, yes. And she reached out and grabbed my hands. And I prayed right there in the power of Jesus Christ that when she got to the hospital, that everything would be normal. And we prayed that in the name of Jesus. She thanked me, and she was crying, and I said, look, I will check back with you in a couple of hours. 2 hours later, I walked into her office area, and she got up from where she was and ran at me and hugged me. She said, guess what? Well, go ahead and tell me. She said, my sister called and said they got her to the hospital, they hooked her up to monitors, everything was going crazy. Her blood pressure was spiking, her heart was racing, and it was evident she was having a heart attack. And she was fearful. And she said, all of a sudden, all the monitors went normal. And she said, all of a sudden, she felt peace, no longer in distress. And the doctors looked at each other and said, what just happened? And Donna said to her sister, well, I know what happened. This guy was in my showroom, and we prayed together for you that everything would be normal. And I gave her a brief testimony of God's grace and the cross. And I said, now listen, you've just seen the power of Jesus Christ at work. This is what Christians are called to see. We're called to live in a limitless world, not a limited world. And I said, who are you going to tell this story to? She said, oh, everybody I see. Because see, that's what these kind of things are for. They're not just so that we can say, I was part of the healing. No, none of this is about pride. This is about calling on God's power to draw people to Jesus Christ. Well, the third thing I believe that your God box determines about you is how you live, and how you live a missional life that is focused on God and drawing others to Him. Now, as I looked at this passage, if you look at verses 2 through 8 and you go right to 12, all of it makes sense together at first blush. It's all a dissertation on faith. But there's 3 little verses in here that at first didn't make sense to me. And let's read them. Verse 9, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorched heat and withers the grass. If flower falls, its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. So why does James talk about the lowly and the rich and the brevity of life in the middle of a dissertation on faith? I believe it's to express a very deep truth about living a life focused on God's mission based on unwavering faith, knowing that whatever comes our way, we are limited by time. We are all limited by time to invest in the things of God. I have 2 stories of people who I believe were missional. And we all should be missional. I'm convicted of that every morning I wake up. 4 weeks ago, I stood here and preached at a funeral for Eileen Hathaway. Eileen Hathaway, many years ago, had been a faithful worker here in our Sunday school with children, his loved children. But she has been homebound in a nursing facility for many years. And her 2 places of mission she felt now called to were prayer and knitting hats. As we went through her Bible and preparing for her funeral, she had a long prayer list for people. She spent much of her day praying for people. And she even had a special list of pastors she was praying for. And I found my name on that list. And it made me weep. But the other thing Eileen did was she was knitting hats. And if you were on her prayer list, you got a hat to remind you that she was praying for you. But a couple times a year, Eileen would also knit maybe a dozen or 2 dozen hats, and she would get some help from her relatives, and they would box them up and send them off as a message of Jesus' love to a Native American reservation for children. Missional. 89 years old when Eileen passed away. She had a long time to invest. And then I think of my Uncle Raymond, who I never knew. At the time of this story, my mother, there were 4 children in her family. Kurt, the oldest, was 13 or 14. My mother was 9. Raymond was 6, and Marion, who had passed away the previous year from appendicitis at 3 years old. Raymond, by all accounts, my mother was really kind of an angel. He accepted Jesus at 4. And he had the propensity to witness to everyone he came in contact with. His first question to you, or a playmate, no matter what the age was, do you know Jesus? And if you didn't, he would, with all of the theology he could muster at 5 and 6, he would share Jesus. Well, then one day he got sick with pneumonia, and evidently in the 1930s, that was still a pretty dangerous sickness. Went into the hospital, wasn't doing real well, and a couple, 2-3 weeks drug on, and he was on oxygen, and started to make a little progress. But every nurse and every doctor who came into that hospital room, first question from Raymond, do you know Jesus? Well, one day one of the nurses was ministering to Raymond, and she said, oh, Raymond, won't it be fun to go home, play with all your toys and your friends again? Won't that be great? And with a smile, Raymond looked at her and said, I'm not going home. She was shocked. What do you mean? Well, he says, Jesus is coming for me. I'm never going home. Oh, she said, no, you're going to get well. Well, a few days later, Raymond lapsed into unconsciousness. It was evident that he was going to pass away, so the doctor called the family, and so Mom and Dad and Uncle Kurt and Helen and their pastor came. And as they were standing there praying, Raymond did something he had not done in several days. He sat bolt upright with a smile on his face. His eyes, blue eyes, clear for once. And he said, oh, do you see him? He's here. He's here for me. And with that, Raymond fell back softly on his pillow and went home. You see, at 6, he had completed his mission. His mission was a simple one. Do you know Jesus? And that's all of our mission. Sometimes people say, I wish God would just show me what to do. What's my mission? Your mission and my mission is, do you know Jesus? And are we experiencing that power that's available through the cross? Well, what are the results of living with an expanded God box? First of all, I believe we start living missionally. This has been a conviction of mine. Every day we wake up and with the Apostle Paul ask, am I worthy of the calling of the gospel? If we were standing beneath the cross today, how would our lives look? Second, we live in a way that allows God to work out our salvation so that we become complete and lack nothing. And thirdly, we act in ways that draw others to Jesus. Friends, I want to live in a world that is more explained by God's presence than by my existence. Look at the final verse of the passage. Verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood that test of time, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. So the eternal result is this thing called the crown of life. And what is the crown of life? I do not believe that when we get to heaven, God is going to throw physical crowns our way. Because we're only there by the grace of God. I believe that the crown of life is the crowning act of Jesus Christ saving death on the cross and his victorious resurrection. It is that power that is able to make us complete and perfect, lacking nothing. We are crowned by his grace. We are crowned by the power of the cross and by an empty tomb. That is the crown of life. When he completes that, and he then gives us this little benediction in Jude, where Jude writes, now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with great joy. To God our Savior, who alone is wise, be glory and dominion and power both now and forever. Well, I'm going to ask us a couple questions as we close up. The challenge for all of us today is, what kind of a God box do you want to live out the rest of your life with? You know what? We all can have a fresh start today, right? First, do you want to handle trials confident that God is in control and that you are going to see his power? See, 75% of people in the United States don't come to church even on a regular basis, and yet 75% tell us they're Christians. I believe that's because a lot of times our life looks just like the life of our neighbor. And we go through similar trials, and yet they never see God's power at work. All too often that's the case. I want to see God show up. Do you no longer want to be a double-minded person? James really in the Greek says double-souled. Yes, my soul is redeemed. And I live in an opportunity for the Spirit to work in my life so that I actively am believing what I say. That I trust God and I believe God can do great things. Or am I tossed by every trouble and end up over here in doubt because my whole experience has been that God doesn't show up in really powerful ways. And I become defeated. Which way do we want to live? Thirdly, do you want to have a missional life, purposefully looking for ways to bless others with the power of God and with the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ? For those of you who today are here that know Christ, my prayer is that your faith will grow so that you will see him in above and beyond what you could even ask or think. That your God box will be exploded so that your expectation is limitless instead of being limited by experience. If you're here today and you say, Dan, I don't have a God box. I don't know Jesus. But I have plenty of trials in my life and I would really like God to show up. Well, I would invite you to accept Christ as Savior today. And to see the journey that he takes you on, and to see how he builds a God box of faith for you. Again, if you're like me and you've been convicted about your size of God box, a limited faith that doesn't expect too much from God. Look, I pray that all of us want God to show up in big ways, because I believe he's got a special mission for this church. A church that's known in the community as a place where God regularly shows up in miraculous and powerful ways. And so that's our prayer today. As I close, if you're in one of those cases that you really want a new God box, you really want a new God box, you want to see God show up in ways in your life that draw others to Jesus Christ, I invite you to come down here as Tim plays. And we're going to pray. Just pray. And if you need to have a God box for the first time, I invite you to come down here too. It's just a simple act of saying, you know what? I really want my God to show up in new ways. Well, let's pray together. Let's stand. Father, today I pray that all of us, each of us, desire a new start. That we would not be limited by often a faithless way of living in the past, or experiences that have caused us to doubt. We sing about the mighty power of God. This is our God. And yet, all too often, we let the waves of this world overcome us. So I pray that each of us would seek to expand our God box from this moment forward in ways that bring no glory to us, but glory to you, and help draw others to Jesus. That we would consistently ask, do you know my Jesus? That we would live in that way, missional. I pray that we would make that decision individually and as a body. So In the light of your cross, we pray this. Amen.